Close your eyes and step into the sands of time. Tonight, we journey to ancient Egypt, a civilization lost beneath the desert, where pharaohs walked as gods, and secrets were carved into stone for eternity. Let the whispers of the Nile carry you into peaceful sleep. This is nightly lore. The Nile shaped everything. Each morning, farmers walked to its banks to check the water level, their bare feet pressing into the cool mud. The river rose and fell with the seasons, and people planned their lives around its schedule. During the flood season, water spread across the valley floor, leaving rich black soil behind. This was when families repaired their homes and tools, waiting for the waters to recede. When the river was low, everyone worked the fields. Children helped scatter seeds, while their parents cut channels to guide precious water to the crops. The whole village moved together through these tasks, starting before dawn when the air was still cool. By midday, most sought shelter from the sun, resuming work as shadows grew long. The Nile provided more than water and soil. Fishermen set out in papyrus boats, their nets dragging through the current. Women washed clothes at the river's edge, talking quietly while ibis birds waited nearby. Merchants loaded boats with grain and pottery, using the river as their highway between towns. Even in sleep, people remained connected to the river. They dreamed to the sound of water lapping against the shore, knowing tomorrow's rhythms would follow the same eternal pattern. The walls of Egyptian homes were made from mud and straw, shaped into bricks and dried beneath the desert sun. Stone was precious, reserved for temples and tombs that would stand forever. But for the living, mud brick was enough. It kept rooms cool when the afternoon heat pressed down, and held warmth through the chill of desert nights. Workers would gather mud from the Nile's banks after the floodwaters receded. They mixed it with chopped straw, pressed it into wooden molds, then laid the bricks in neat rows to bake under the sky. A single home might need thousands of these bricks, each one made by hand, each one carrying the rhythm of daily labor. These mud brick houses rose in clusters along the river valley. Their flat roofs became extra rooms under the stars, where families slept on summer nights when the air hung heavy inside. The walls were thick, sometimes plastered white to reflect the sun. Small windows kept the brightness at bay, while letting the river breeze slip through. When a house grew old and crumbled, its bricks returned to earth, and new walls rose from the same eternal mud. In the warm Egyptian night, families prepared for sleep in their modest homes. The day's heat still lingered in the mud brick walls, though the desert air had begun to cool. Most households had simple raised platforms for sleeping, constructed from mud bricks or wooden frames. These low structures lifted sleepers just above the floor, away from insects and the occasional scorpion that might wander in from the courtyard. The platforms were covered with woven reed mats, sometimes layered with linen sheets for those who could afford them. Wooden headrests, carved and polished smooth, supported the neck rather than the head. This kept the body cooler through the night and protected elaborate hairstyles worn by both men and women. Children often shared a platform with their parents when young, while older siblings might sleep on their own smaller platforms nearby. The sleeping chamber remained quite bare compared to the rest of the home. A few pottery vessels for water stood in the corner. Perhaps a small oil lamp flickered on a shelf, casting shadows on the whitewashed walls. Through the small high windows, the faint sound of the Nile's flowing waters mixed with the distant call of night birds, creating a gentle rhythm that carried the household into sleep. The sun rose over the eastern cliffs, and already the air began to shimmer. In the narrow streets of the village, people moved quickly through the early morning coolness. Farmers headed to their fields while the dew still clung to the earth. Potters arranged their wet clay before the heat could crack it. Stone carvers began their work in the quarries, knowing they had only a few hours before the rock would become too hot to touch. By midday, the sun pressed down like a weight. Work in the fields stopped. The potters covered their wheels. Even the donkeys sought shade beneath the palm fronds. Inside the mud brick houses, families rested on reed mats. The thick walls kept the rooms darker and cooler than the blazing world outside. Children dozed while their mothers spun flax in the dim light filtering through small windows. As the sun began its descent, the village stirred again. Water carriers emerged with their jars. Farmers returned to tend their crops in the gentler light. The rhythm of mallets on chisels resumed in the workshops. This dance with the sun repeated each day, as natural as the rise and fall of the Nile itself. The first stirrings came while darkness still held the valley. In the mud brick houses along the Nile, families would wake to the coolness before dawn. The air moved differently in these hours, carrying the river's moisture through doorways and small windows. Mothers would rise first, their bare feet silent on the packed earth floors as they rekindled yesterday's embers. The eastern sky showed the faintest suggestion of light. This was the precious time when the crushing heat of midday seemed impossibly distant. Farmers gathered their tools in the dimness, preparing for hours in the fields while the earth remained cool beneath their feet. Water carriers filled their jars at the river, where mist still clung to the reeds. Even the animals seemed to understand this rhythm, the donkeys standing patiently as their loads were secured, the cattle moving slowly toward the cultivation plots. The whole settlement moved with quiet purpose in these early hours. Children helped with simple tasks, learning the pattern their parents had learned from their own parents. By the time Rastus cleared the horizon, much of the day's hardest work was already underway. This was how life flowed in the Nile Valley, shaped by the sun's journey across the sky. In the villages along the Nile, the smell of baking bread drifted through doorways as the sun climbed higher. Women ground wheat on flat stones, the rhythmic sound echoing through mud brick courtyards. The grain came from fields blessed by the annual flood, stored in clay jars kept cool in shadowed corners. Bread took many forms: round loaves for daily meals, flat breads baked on hot stones, sweeter breads mixed with honey for festivals. Each household knew their own recipes, passed down through generations of bakers. The dough rose slowly in the warm air while children played nearby, waiting for their portion. Beer flowed alongside bread at every meal, thick and nutritious, nothing like the clear brews of later times. Women stirred barley in large pots, letting it ferment under cloth covers. The resulting drink was filtered through baskets, poured into cups for workers returning from the fields. Even children drank weak beer, safer than river water. Bread and beer formed the foundation of life, payment for labor, offerings for temples, food for journeys. The Pharaohs' workers received daily rations, measured precisely. In homes both humble and grand, these simple foods sustained a civilization through 3,000 years of sunrises. In the villages along the Nile, the harvest moon brought both celebration and careful planning. As farmers gathered their wheat and barley from the fields, they knew these golden stores would need to last through the months ahead. The grain moved from field to home in steady procession, carried in baskets woven from river reeds. Each household had its storage jars, tall vessels of fired clay that stood in the coolest corners of mud brick homes. Women would seal these containers with cloth and clay, protecting the precious grain from moisture and pests. The rhythmic sound of pestles grinding grain into flour marked the early morning hours, a task as regular as the sunrise itself. Larger communities maintained communal granaries, substantial buildings with thick walls and small windows. Here, village scribes recorded each family's contribution, marking clay tablets with careful notation. The air inside these storehouses stayed cool and dry, heavy with the earthy scent of wheat and barley. When the flood season arrived and fields lay beneath the water, these reserves sustained entire communities. Night watchmen guarded these treasures, their oil lamps casting soft shadows across the storage rooms, while the village slept peacefully, knowing tomorrow's bread was secure. The farming year in Egypt moved with the river's rhythm. Each summer, the Nile would swell and spread across the land, carrying dark soil from the mountains far to the south. Farmers watched the water levels carefully, measuring the rise against stone markers along the riverbanks. When the floods came, the fields disappeared beneath the water for weeks. This was not a time of worry, but of preparation. While their land rested under the gentle flood, farmers repaired their tools, strengthened irrigation channels, and planned the coming harvest. The whole village would gather to reinforce the mud brick walls that guided the precious water. As the river withdrew, it left behind a layer of rich black earth. The farmers called this fertile soil Kemet, the black land. They would walk out into the still damp fields, feeling the soft mud between their toes, and begin planting barley and emmer wheat. The seeds pressed into the moist earth needed no watering at first. The river had done its work. Year after year, generation after generation, this cycle continued. The flood, the planting, the harvest. Life along the Nile moved in this steady pattern, as reliable as the sunrise. The morning air was still cool when villagers gathered at the canal's edge. Each family sent someone to help with the work. Their tools simple but effective: wooden boards for shaping the banks, red baskets for moving earth. The canal stretched through their fields like a lifeline, carrying water from the Nile to their crops. Men worked in rhythm, clearing away the silt that had built up during the last flood season. The mud was dark and rich, and they spread it carefully along the banks where it would nourish new plants. Women and children helped too, weaving new reed mats to line vulnerable sections where the water ran fastest. Men worked in rhythm, clearing away the silt that had built up during the last flood season. The mud was dark and rich, and they spread it carefully along the banks where it would nourish new plants. Women and children helped too, weaving new reed mats to line vulnerable sections where the water ran fastest. The overseer walked among them, not commanding but coordinating. He knew every bend in the canal, every spot where the water liked to overflow during inundation. His grandfather had done this work, and his grandfather before him. The knowledge passed down through generations, each one teaching the next where to strengthen the banks, how to read the water's mood. By midday, when the sun grew fierce, they would rest in the shade of the date palms. Tomorrow they would continue, maintaining the channels that fed their wheat, their barley, their life along the river. The fishermen of Egypt rose before dawn, their reed boats already waiting at the river's edge. The Nile gave them perch and catfish, mullet and eel, enough to feed their families and fill the market stalls. They used nets woven from plant fibers, spreading them wide across the calm morning water. Some preferred hooks made from bone or bronze, baited with bread or insects. The river was generous but demanded respect. Fishermen knew where the crocodiles rested and which currents might pull their small boats too far from shore. They worked in groups, calling to each other across the water. As they hauled in their nets, the best catches came during the flood season, when fish moved into the shallows to spawn. By midday, the boats returned heavy with their silver harvest. Women and children waited on the riverbank to help sort the catch. Small fish went into baskets for drying in the sun. Larger ones would be cleaned and salted, preserved for the months when fishing was harder. Fresh fish traveled quickly to nearby homes and temples, where cooks prepared them with onions and herbs, creating meals that sustained workers, building monuments, and farmers tending fields. The river fed them all. The morning sun warmed the marketplace as merchants arranged their wares on woven mats and wooden tables. Voices rose and fell in gentle rhythms of negotiation, blending with the sounds of donkeys shifting under their loads and chickens rustling in reed cages. A potter displayed rows of clay vessels while nearby, a woman sorted through baskets of dates and figs, their sweet scent mixing with the earthiness of fresh barley. Traders moved between the stalls, examining linen cloth held up to catch the light, testing the weight of copper tools in their palms. Some bartered grain for sandals, others exchanged dried fish for pottery. The transactions flowed like the river itself, each person knowing their role in this daily dance of commerce. Children wove through the crowds, carrying water jugs, while scribes sat in shaded corners, recording larger trades on papyrus. The metallic ring of weights being placed on scales punctuated conversations about harvest yields and river levels. As the sun climbed higher, awnings cast cooling shadows where people paused to share news from other villages. This gentle chaos of exchange would continue until the afternoon heat sent everyone seeking rest. Along the banks of the Nile, the morning market came alive with the sounds of negotiation. A farmer approached a potter's stall, carrying a basket of fresh barley on his hip. He needed new storage jars for the coming harvest. The potter examined the grain, running it through her fingers, checking its quality. After some discussion, they agreed on an exchange: 3 baskets of barley for 2 medium jars. This was the rhythm of Egyptian commerce. Grain served as the foundation of most trades. Workers received their wages in bread and beer rations. Scribes earned their pay in measures of wheat. Even taxes were collected as portions of the harvest, stored in great royal granaries. The system worked through a careful evaluation. A sandal maker might trade a pair of leather sandals for several loaves of bread, a jug of beer, and perhaps a small pot of oil. Skilled craftsmen commanded more valuable exchanges. A furniture maker could trade a well-made stool for enough grain to feed a family for weeks. Each transaction required trust, knowledge of value, and sometimes lengthy negotiation under the shade of the market awnings. In the workers' quarter of Deir el-Medina, the smell of wet clay and fresh-cut stone drifted through narrow streets at dawn. The potters lived just steps from their wheels, their homes backing onto the workshops, where generations had shaped vessels for daily use and temple offerings. Each morning brought the familiar sounds of craft and creation through thin mud brick walls. The stone carvers kept their tools in small alcoves beside their doorways. Their children played with limestone chips in the courtyards, while their fathers worked on statues and relief panels destined for royal tombs. The proximity meant they could work late into the evening when deadlines pressed. Guided by oil lamps that cast moving shadows across unfinished faces of gods and pharaohs, painters stored their pigments in ceramic jars on shelves built into their homes' walls. The red ochre from the desert, the blue from crushed lapis, the black from charcoal. Each color had its place in both workshop and household. Their wives often helped prepare the plaster surfaces while preparing the evening meal, the two activities flowing together in the rhythm of daily life. This closeness between home and craft shaped entire neighborhoods, where skills passed naturally from parent to child through simple observation and quiet practice. Clay vessels lined the walls of every Egyptian home, their smooth surfaces cool to the touch in the desert heat. Potters shaped these containers with practiced hands, creating jars for grain, water jugs with narrow necks, and small bottles for precious oils. The pottery workshop stood near the river, where workers could easily fetch water to mix with clay. In the storage rooms of houses, large jars held barley and emmer wheat, sealed with mud stoppers to keep out mice and insects. Smaller vessels contained beer, the daily drink of workers and nobles alike. Oil jars sat in special niches, their contents used for cooking, lamp fuel, and rubbing on skin dried by the desert air. The shapes told their own stories: wide-mouthed bowls for grinding grain, tall amphorae for transporting goods along the Nile, tiny perfume bottles that fit in the palm of a hand. Some bore the marks of their makers, others carried painted symbols indicating their contents. In the quiet of evening, families would gather around these simple vessels, pouring beer, sharing bread, the pottery as essential to their lives as the river itself. Along the river banks where the soil stayed moist through the growing season, fields of flax stretched toward the horizon. The slender plants grew tall and straight, their delicate blue flowers opening in the early morning light. Farmers knew these fields required special care, different from their barley or wheat. The flax needed just the right amount of water, not too much, not too little. When harvest time came, families worked together, pulling the plants from the ground, roots and all. The stalks would be laid out in shallow water for weeks, weighted down with stones. This soaking softened the outer layers, releasing the precious fibers within. Women and children would beat the dried stalks with wooden tools, separating the useful threads from the woody stems. The work was hard on the hands, but necessary. These fibers would be combed and spun into thread, then woven into linen cloth. In the heat of the Egyptian sun, linen kept the body cool and comfortable. From the simplest worker's kilt to the finest pleated garments worn in the palace, all came from these modest blue-flowered plants growing beside the great river. The sun above the Nile Valley brought warmth that lasted through most of the year. In this heat, the people of Egypt dressed simply. Men working in the fields often wore nothing more than a short kilt made of linen, wrapped around the waist and tied with a simple knot. The fabric was light, allowing the river breeze to pass through as they bent over their crops or carried water from the canals. Women wore straight dresses that fell from the shoulders to the ankles. These garments were made from the same white linen, woven thin enough that the afternoon light could filter through. Children ran barefoot through the village streets, their bodies bare or covered with the smallest scraps of cloth. Even the wealthy, who could afford more elaborate garments, chose fine linens that breathed in the heat. Their clothing might have pleated folds or colored edges, but the fabric remained light against the skin. As evening approached and the air grew cooler, a simple shawl might be added. The night brought relief from the sun, but even then, the warmth lingered in the mud brick walls and the packed earth of the courtyards. In the markets of Memphis, the jewelry makers sat cross-legged on reed mats, their fingers working gold wire into delicate patterns. Men stopped to examine thick gold collars that would rest against their bare chests during festivals. Women held up polished bronze mirrors to see how faience beads would look woven through their braided hair. The workshop district hummed with the soft tap of copper hammers, shaping silver into lotus blossoms. A scribe paused at a stall, running his fingers over a carnelian seal ring that would mark his papyrus documents. His wife beside him admired matching bracelets of lapis lazuli, imagining them against her wrists as she ground grain in the morning light. Even farmers saved copper rings from harvest wages, wearing them on work-worn fingers as they guided oxen through muddy fields. Children learned to string simple clay beads, practicing the patterns they would one day create in precious metals. At night, these ornaments caught the oil lamp flames in homes along the river, from the smallest mud brick houses to the painted halls where officials dined. Each piece told its own quiet story of the hands that made it and the life that wore it. In the cool morning air, before the sun climbed too high, people throughout Egypt would begin their daily preparations. The small clay vessels of perfumed oil sat on wooden shelves or stone ledges, waiting. These oils were pressed from moringa seeds, from sesame, from the fragrant lilies that bloomed along the river's edge, mixed with cinnamon bark brought by traders, with myrrh resin, with lotus petals gathered at dawn. Both men and women would pour a small amount into their palms, warming the oil between their hands. They smoothed it over their skin, which had grown dry from the desert air and the constant sun. The oil served many purposes. It protected the skin, yes, but it also carried the sense that marked a person as clean, as respectable, as someone who took care in their appearance. Workers heading to the fields might use simpler oils, perhaps just crushed moringa with a hint of herb. Those serving in the temples required specific scents, frankincense for certain ceremonies, blue lotus for others. The wealthy had elaborate bottles made of alabaster, while common folk kept their oils in simple pottery jars. But the morning ritual remained the same. The gentle application of oil, the soft fragrance rising in the air, the preparation for another day beneath the Egyptian sun. The mud brick walls of Egyptian homes were thick and solid, built to keep the desert heat outside. During the hottest part of the day, these walls stayed cool to the touch, even as the sun blazed overhead. Small windows set high in the walls let in light, but kept out the direct rays. The rooms inside remained dim and pleasant. Many houses had a central courtyard, where families could work in the shade. The packed earth floor felt cool under bare feet. In the kitchen area, clay jars filled with water slowly released moisture into the air. The gentle evaporation helped cool the space naturally. On the flat rooftops, reed mats provided shade for those who climbed up to catch the evening breeze. As the sun moved lower, the thick walls that had kept heat out all day now held on to the coolness of the interior. The design was simple but effective. Narrow doorways and small openings controlled the flow of air through the house. In the sleeping quarters, low platforms raised beds slightly off the ground, allowing air to circulate underneath. The builders understood their climate well, creating homes that worked with the rhythms of heat and cool. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, families across Egypt made their way up narrow stairs to the flat rooftops of their mud brick homes. The day's heat still radiated from the walls below, but up here, the first whispers of evening breeze brought relief. These rooftops served as open-air rooms throughout the warmer months. Simple reed mats were unrolled, creating comfortable spaces where households gathered as darkness approached. The grandmother might sit against a low parapet wall, her fingers working steadily at basket weaving even in the fading light. Children played quiet games with clay pieces, while their parents reclined nearby, sharing the day's news in soft voices. From this vantage point, the village spread out below in a patchwork of similar flat-top dwellings. Cooking fires sent thin columns of smoke rising into the still air. The distant sound of cattle being led back from the fields, mixed with the closer murmur of neighboring families settling onto their own rooftops. As stars emerged, one by one, many chose to sleep here rather than descend to the stuffier rooms below. The gentle night air and open sky made these simple platforms into peaceful sanctuaries. As the sun lowered toward the western horizon, the villages along the Nile began their gentle transformation. The harsh heat of midday gave way to cooler air, and people emerged from their homes and workshops. Workers returned from the fields, their tools resting against mud brick walls, as families gathered in courtyards. The smell of bread baking in clay ovens drifted through the narrow streets. Women ground grain on stone querns, the rhythmic sound joining with quiet conversations. Children played simple games with sticks and stones, while adults shared the day's events. Beer jars were opened, the barley brew poured into cups as neighbors visited between houses. In the fading light, oil lamps began to flicker in windows. Groups formed on rooftops where the evening breeze was strongest. Stories passed between generations, tales of the gods, memories of flood seasons, local gossip about marriages and harvests. Musicians sometimes brought their flutes and drums, creating soft melodies that floated over the settlement. This was the hour when work ceased and community flourished. As darkness deepened, the village sounds gradually quieted, preparing for another night along the eternal river. In the evening hours, as oil lamps cast their warm glow across mud brick walls, families would gather in courtyards and common rooms. The day's work was done, and now came the time for stories. A grandmother might begin speaking of the great battles between Horus and Set, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the tale. Children sat cross-legged on reed mats, their eyes wide as she described how the gods shaped the world. These stories traveled from house to house, village to village. A merchant returning from Thebes might share new versions he'd heard in the markets there. Tales of clever peasants outwitting crocodiles, of magical transformations, of pharaohs who spoke with the gods, each telling added new details, new flourishes. A storyteller might pause to let the night sounds of the Nile fill the silence before continuing. The stories served many purposes. They taught proper behavior, explained natural phenomena, preserved history, but mostly, they connected people to each other and to their ancestors. As voices grew softer and children's eyelids grew heavy, the ancient tales wove themselves into dreams, carrying their listeners gently toward sleep. Music moved through Egyptian life, like the river itself, present in every gathering from dawn markets to evening festivals. In the temple courtyards, professional musicians would arrive early, carrying their instruments wrapped in linen cloth. The sistrum, a sacred rattle made of bronze, created a shimmering sound that drew people together. Its gentle rhythm marked the beginning of ceremonies, while harps and flutes filled the air with melodies passed down through generations of players. In village squares, drummers set the pace for celebration. Their steady beats guided dancers who moved in careful patterns, their white linen garments catching the fading light. Musicians often worked in groups, some keeping rhythm while others played the melodies. The double pipes produced a reedy sound that could be heard across the water, calling people from their evening tasks. Even in modest homes, families kept simple instruments. A wooden clapper or small drum might rest in the corner, ready for moments when work gave way to song. Children learned rhythms by watching their elders, absorbing the patterns that connected one generation to the next. As night settled over the villages, the last notes would fade into darkness, leaving only the eternal sound of the river. In the cool evening hours, music drifted through Egyptian homes and courtyards. The soft plucking of harp strings created gentle melodies that floated on the night air. These harps came in different sizes. Some were small enough to hold while walking. Others stood tall in temple halls, where musicians played during ceremonies. The flute added its own voice to the musical life of Egypt. Carved from reeds that grew along the Nile's banks, these instruments produced clear, sweet notes. Musicians would sit cross-legged in the shade, their fingers moving across the holes while their breath gave life to the hollow stems. The sound carried across village squares and into palace gardens. Music accompanied many parts of daily life. Workers in the fields sometimes heard flute players marking the rhythm of their labor. During harvest celebrations, harps and flutes combined with singing voices. In wealthy households, skilled musicians entertained guests during evening meals. The instruments themselves were often decorated with painted designs or carved details, making them beautiful to look at as well as to hear. At temples, music helped mark the hours of prayer and ritual. The steady notes guided both priests and worshippers through their devotions as incense smoke curled upward in the lamplight. The workshop hummed with quiet activity as sunlight filtered through the small window. A boy of 8 summers sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor, watching his father's hands shape wet clay on the potter's wheel. The wheel spun steadily, powered by the gentle kick of his father's foot. Each movement was deliberate, practiced through years of repetition. In houses throughout the village, similar scenes unfolded. The baker's daughter learned to judge when dough had risen properly by its texture and smell. The metal worker's son pumped the bellows, maintaining the precise heat needed to shape copper tools. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation and practice. Girls often worked alongside their mothers, grinding grain in the courtyard or weaving linen on wooden looms. Boys might follow their fathers to the fields, learning which season brought the flood and when to plant barley and wheat. Some fortunate children whose parents served in temples would learn to read hieroglyphs, tracing symbols in the dust before graduating to papyrus. By evening, small hands would be tired from the day's work. The skills they practiced would one day sustain their own families, continuing traditions that stretched back countless generations along the banks of the Nile. In the villages along the Nile, most children learned their trades by watching their parents. A potter's son would sit beside his father at the wheel, feeling the wet clay take shape beneath practiced hands. Daughters followed their mothers to the fields, learning which plants grew best in the rich black soil after the floodwaters receded. But in the temple complexes and administrative buildings, a different kind of learning took place. Here, young boys selected for their quick minds and steady hands would spend years mastering the art of writing. These future scribes sat cross-legged on reed mats, their backs straight, as they practiced forming hieroglyphs with reed brushes on pieces of broken pottery. The scribe schools began before dawn. Students would copy texts by the light of oil lamps, their teachers walking between them, correcting the angle of a bird symbol here, the curve of a water sign there. They memorized prayers, legal formulas, and mathematical calculations. Reading and writing were precious skills, tools that opened doors to positions in temples, royal courts, and merchant houses. Most Egyptians never learned these symbols. They knew their world through spoken words, through the songs of workers in the fields and the stories told by firelight, in the quiet courtyards of temples and administrative buildings. Scribes sat cross-legged with their writing boards balanced on their laps. These men held a special position in Egyptian society, for they possessed the rare ability to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script that recorded everything from grain harvests to sacred texts. The path to becoming a scribe began in childhood. Young boys from various social backgrounds would enter scribal schools, where they spent years copying texts and learning the hundreds of symbols that made up their written language. The reed pen became an extension of their hand, and the preparation of ink from soot and gum Arabic became a daily ritual. Their work touched every aspect of Egyptian life. In the morning light, scribes recorded the flooding levels of the Nile. They counted cattle in the fields and measured grain in the storehouses. In the great temples, they copied religious texts onto papyrus scrolls, preserving the words of prayers and hymns. Royal scribes documented the pharaoh's decrees and correspondence with foreign lands. This literacy gave them access to positions of influence, and many scribes rose to become advisors, tax collectors, and temple administrators. Their careful records kept the kingdom functioning smoothly, season after season. Along the riverbanks where the Nile meets the desert, papyrus reeds grew tall in the shallow waters. Workers would wade into these marshy areas during the cooler morning hours, cutting the stems close to their base. The harvested reeds were carried back to workshops where scribes and craftsmen waited. The process of making papyrus sheets required patience and skill. Workers would peel away the outer green layer, revealing the white pith inside. They cut this inner material into thin strips, laying them side by side on flat stones. Another layer was placed crosswise on top. The assembled strips were then pressed and left to dry under weighted boards for several days. When ready, the dried sheets had a smooth, pale surface that accepted ink well. Scribes would test each sheet with their reed pens, checking for rough spots that might catch the tip. The finished papyrus was rolled and stored in clay jars, protected from moisture and insects. In the houses of officials and temples, these rolls contained tax records, religious texts, and letters. The scratching sound of reed pens on papyrus filled quiet rooms, where scribes worked by oil lamplight, recording the daily business of Egyptian life. Along the Nile, scribes sat cross-legged in courtyards and temple halls, their reed pens moving steadily across papyrus. The soft scratch of writing filled administrative buildings from dawn until dusk. These men, trained from childhood in the art of hieroglyphs, kept the kingdom functioning through careful record-keeping. In Memphis, a scribe might spend his morning recording grain deliveries from the harvest. Each sack counted, each measurement noted. His afternoon could bring tax assessments or letters from distant provinces. The papyrus beneath his hands held the memory of the kingdom, who owed what, which fields produced well, where workers were needed for the next building project. Messages traveled the river on boats, sealed with clay and marked with official stamps. A letter from Thebes might take days to reach the Delta, but when it arrived, local scribes would copy it, file it, respond to it. Through this network of written words, the Pharaoh's administrators knew the state of every nome, every temple, every major estate. The kingdom breathed through these documents, unified not just by the river, but by the endless flow of inked symbols that connected village to village, transforming spoken orders into permanent records. The harvest season brought more than just relief from months of careful tending. As farmers gathered their wheat and barley, they knew a portion would travel beyond their own storage rooms. Tax collectors moved through the villages, their presence as expected as the flooding of the Nile itself. Grain served as the currency of the kingdom, where coins might have clinked in other lands. Here the rustle of wheat stalks and the weight of barley sacks measured wealth and obligation. Farmers would carry their contributions to collection points, where scribes carefully recorded each amount on papyrus. The scratch of reed pens marked down quantities that would feed soldiers, support temple workers, and fill the royal granaries. In the storage facilities along the river, the grain accumulated in great heaps. The air hung thick with golden dust as workers moved the harvest into place. These reserves would sustain Egypt through lean times and demonstrate the Pharaoh's ability to provide for his people. The system connected every farmer to the great machinery of the state. Their labor transformed into the very substance that kept the kingdom strong. The temple at Karnak rises beside the Nile, its limestone walls warm from the afternoon sun. Beyond the sacred halls where priests perform their rituals, the complex hums with everyday activity. Scribes sit cross-legged in shaded courtyards, recording deliveries of grain brought by farmers from nearby fields. The temple owns vast stretches of land along the river, worked by thousands who depend on this institution for their livelihood. In the storage rooms, workers stack jars of oil and wine, bolts of linen, and sacks of barley. The temple functions like a great estate, collecting harvests, distributing wages, and trading surplus goods. Craftsmen shape gold into ritual objects in the workshops, while weavers create fine cloth for both ceremonies and trade. The high priest oversees not just religious duties, but manages this vast economic network that feeds and employs much of Thebes. Merchants arrive at the temple gates with exotic incense from Punt, knowing they'll find ready buyers here. The wealth flowing through these sacred grounds supports artists, builders, farmers, and priests alike. As evening approaches, workers receive their daily rations of bread and beer, payment from an institution that serves both the gods and the practical needs of its people. Before dawn, while the villages along the Nile still slept, priests began their first purification. They washed in the sacred lake within the temple grounds, the cool water cleansing their bodies for the day's rituals. This washing happened 4 times each day, always with natron salt dissolved in the water, leaving their skins smooth and clean. Inside the temple, the morning routine never changed. The priests opened the doors to the inner sanctuary where the god's statue lived. They removed yesterday's offerings of bread and beer, replacing them with fresh food. The statue received new linen wrappings, and priests burned incense that filled the dark chambers with sweet smoke. Every movement followed patterns passed down through generations of temple servants. Between ceremonies, priests studied hieroglyphic texts or taught younger initiates the proper words for each prayer. They ate simple meals of vegetables and fish, avoiding foods considered impure. When the sun reached its peak, they performed the midday offering. As evening approached, they sealed the sanctuary doors again, leaving the god to rest in darkness. Their days moved in steady rhythm, each task connecting the earthly temple to the divine order they served. Before dawn, the temple priests would begin their preparations. The sacred pools lay still in the courtyard, reflecting the last stars as the sky began to lighten. Each priest would descend the stone steps into the cool water, washing away the ordinary world before entering the god's house. The purification rituals followed precise patterns passed down through generations. First the hands, then the mouth, rinsing away any impure words. The priests would shave their entire bodies, removing all hair to present themselves clean before the divine. Even their clothing had specific requirements. Only the finest white linen could touch their skin, woven by temple weavers who themselves maintained ritual purity. Inside the temple, every surface was cleaned daily with natron and sacred water. The floors were swept with palm fronds, the altars wiped with linen cloths. Incense burned continuously, its smoke carrying prayers upward while purifying the air. The priests changed their sandals at each threshold, never carrying dust from one sacred space to another. This attention to cleanliness created a sense of order that separated the holy chambers from the bustling world outside the temple walls. The temple courtyard fills with the sweet drift of frankincense as priests prepare for the morning ritual. Smoke rises in thin columns from bronze censers, carried by attendants who move between the stone pillars with practiced steps. The scent mingles with myrrh and kefi, that special blend reserved for sacred ceremonies. In the inner sanctum, where few may enter, the high priest swings a long-handled censer before the statue of the god. The smoke creates shifting patterns in the lamplight, while outside, villagers gather in the open court, breathing in the familiar fragrance that marks holy days and festivals. The incense arrives from distant lands, carried by traders whose caravans cross harsh deserts. Frankincense trees grow far to the south, their resin carefully harvested and wrapped in leather pouches. The priests store these precious materials in sealed jars within the temple walls, measuring each portion with care. As the ceremony continues, the smoke grows thicker, transforming the air itself into something sacred. Children watch from their parents' shoulders as the procession moves through the courtyard, the censers swaying gently, leaving trails of scented smoke that linger long after the priests have passed. In the quiet hours before dawn, temple priests carried baskets of fresh bread toward the inner sanctum. The offerings had been prepared through the night, round loaves still warm from the ovens, jars of beer brewed from barley, plates of roasted duck arranged with care. Each morning began this way, with food placed before the statue of the god who dwelt within the temple walls. The priests moved through corridors lit by oil lamps, their footsteps soft against the stone floors. They believed the god's spirit would descend to receive these gifts, drawing sustenance from the essence of the food. After the proper time had passed, the offerings would be distributed among the temple workers. Nothing wasted in this careful exchange between the earthly and divine. Beyond the temple walls, ordinary people made their own offerings. A farmer might leave a handful of grain at a small shrine. A baker could place a special loaf aside for the household gods. These acts wove through daily life like the river through the valley, connecting each person to the world of the gods through the simple sharing of food. In the corner of most Egyptian homes, a small shrine stood watch over daily life. These household shrines were simple structures, often just a niche in the mud brick wall, or a wooden shelf holding sacred objects. The family would place offerings here each morning: a bit of bread, a cup of water, perhaps a flower from the garden. The household gods were familiar presences. Base, with his lion-like face and protective nature, watched over mothers and children. Toret, the hippopotamus goddess, stood guard during childbirth. Small statues or amulets of these deities rested in the shrine, their painted features worn smooth by generations of careful hands. At sunset, when work in the fields was done, family members would pause before the shrine. The mother might light a small oil lamp, its flame casting dancing shadows on the wall. Children learned early to speak their hopes and worries to these household protectors. The shrine connected the rhythms of home, life to the greater order of the cosmos, offering comfort in times of illness or uncertainty. Through these quiet daily rituals, each family maintained their own sacred space within the humble walls of their home. In the quiet hours before dawn, a potter might pause at his workshop doorway, speaking softly to Ra as the first light touched the eastern horizon. These personal prayers were woven through each day, as natural as breathing. A mother grinding grain would murmur thanks to Renanutet, goddess of the harvest, while her children played nearby. The words were simple, direct conversations with the gods, who watched over daily tasks. At the riverside, fishermen cast their nets while offering quick prayers to Sobek, asking for safety from crocodiles and a good catch. No grand temples or priests were needed for these moments. The gods heard equally from palace chambers and mud brick homes. A scribe might touch his writing palette to his forehead, honoring Thoth before beginning his work. A farmer checking his fields at sunset would speak to the earth itself, thanking it for another day's growth. These prayers required no special knowledge or ritual purity. They rose from genuine need and gratitude. In workshops and homes, on boats and in fields, ordinary people maintained their own quiet relationships with the divine, speaking as they would to respected neighbors who happened to hold the power of creation in their hands. Throughout the year, the rhythm of work along the Nile would pause for festival days. Villages that usually focused on planting or harvest would transform, the air filled with the scent of special breads baking in outdoor ovens. Musicians carried their instruments through the narrow streets between mud brick homes. The steady beat of drums echoed across the water. During the festival of Opet in Thebes, thousands gathered to watch the sacred bark of Ammon travel from Karnak to Luxor Temple. Priests carried the golden boat on their shoulders, while people lined the processional way. Some brought offerings of beer and bread. Others simply came to be part of the crowd, to feel the shared anticipation. As the god passed by, in smaller settlements, local celebrations marked the flooding season. Farmers who rarely saw beyond their own fields would meet neighbors from distant plots. They shared food under temporary shelters made of palm fronds. Children ran between the groups of adults, their laughter mixing with the sound of sistrums and flutes. As darkness fell, oil lamps created pools of warm light where people continued their conversations, strengthening the bonds that held their communities together through each turning of the seasons. The streets of Memphis would transform when festival time arrived. Wide thoroughfares that normally carried merchants and workers became rivers of movement and sound. The procession would begin at dawn, when the air still held the night's coolness. Priests carried the sacred bark on their shoulders, the golden shrine catching the early light. Behind them came musicians, their sistrums creating a steady rhythm that echoed off the mud brick walls. People lined the streets, standing 3 and 4 deep. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see over the crowd. The smell of incense drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of lotus garlands that decorated doorways and windows. As the procession passed, people would bow or raise their hands in greeting to the hidden image of the god within the shrine. The route was always the same, following the main avenue from the temple to the river and back. Dancers moved in practiced formations, their white linen swirling. The sound of drums grew louder as the procession approached, then faded as it moved on. By midday, when the heat became fierce, the sacred journey would end, and the streets would slowly return to their everyday rhythm. The river was the great highway of Egypt, flowing north through the valley like a vein of life. Every morning, the water carried hundreds of vessels along its current. Reed boats moved between villages, their curved hulls cutting through the gentle waves. Fishermen pulled their small craft through the shallows near the banks. Larger wooden ships transported grain from the southern fields to the northern cities. The boat builders worked in the shade of palm trees along the shore. They bent planks of acacia wood into smooth curves, joining them with wooden pegs and rope. The smell of fresh-cut timber mixed with the river air. These craftsmen knew each boat by its purpose. A noble's pleasure barge needed a different shape than a cargo vessel carrying stone blocks from the quarries. On the deck of a merchant ship, the crew adjusted the single square sail to catch the southern wind. Below deck, amphorae filled with oil and wine rested in neat rows. The captain watched the western bank slide past, counting the familiar landmarks that marked the distance to Thebes. As the sun lowered, the boats would find sheltered inlets for the night, their anchors dropping into the soft riverbed. The river moved slowly beneath the wooden hull of the merchant vessel, carrying dates and linen from Memphis toward the southern settlements. The captain knew every bend in the river, every sandbar that shifted with the seasons. His crew of 6 men worked the single square sail, adjusting it to catch the north wind that pushed them against the current. Along the banks, villages appeared and faded. Farmers paused in their fields to watch the boat pass. Children ran alongside, their voices carrying across the water before falling behind. The journey from Memphis to Thebes would take nearly 3 weeks, with stops at dozens of settlements along the way. The boat carried more than goods. Letters wrapped in leather pouches connected families separated by hundreds of miles. News traveled with the merchants, which temples needed skilled workers, where the harvest had been generous, where drought had taken hold. At each mooring, the crew traded stories with local fishermen while unloading amphorae of oil and loading sacks of grain. As evening approached, the captain guided his vessel toward a familiar landing. Tomorrow they would continue south, but tonight they would rest on solid ground, sharing bread with strangers who would become friends by morning. The wooden boats moved slowly along the Nile, their hulls heavy with grain sacks and pottery jars. Merchants sat quietly in the shade of reed canopies, watching the riverbanks pass by. The current carried them north toward Memphis, while the southern breeze filled their simple sails. Each boat carried its own small world. Clay vessels held precious oils from distant temples. Bundles of papyrus waited to become scrolls in the scribal schools. Stone blocks rested in the largest vessels, destined for building projects in the capital. The merchants knew every bend in the river, every village where they might trade a jar of beer for fresh bread. At night they moored near settlements, tying their boats to wooden posts driven deep into the muddy banks. The sound of water lapping against the hulls mixed with distant voices from the shore. Guards watched over the cargo, while merchants slept on reed mats, the stars reflecting on the calm water around them. This river trade connected every part of the kingdom. What grew in the south traveled north. What was crafted in the workshops of Memphis journeyed south. The Nile was more than water. It was the pathway that held their world together. The desert stretches endlessly beyond the fertile banks of the Nile, a sea of sand and stone where few dare to venture without careful preparation. Yet caravans move across these harsh lands, their donkeys laden with goods bound for distant settlements and trading posts. These sturdy animals carry grain from the river valley, pottery from village workshops, and precious stones from quarries in the eastern desert. The caravan leaders know every water source along the ancient routes, every sheltered spot where travelers can rest during the heat of midday. They travel by the stars when the air grows cool, their donkeys' hooves creating soft rhythms in the sand. The journey to the Red Sea ports takes many days. At night, the travelers gather around small fires, sharing bread and beer while their animals rest. The desert holds its own quiet beauty under the vast sky. Sometimes they encounter nomadic peoples who trade milk and cheese for grain, or guides who know secret paths through the rocky valleys. When the caravan finally returns to the Nile Valley, the sight of green fields and flowing water feels like a blessing from the gods themselves. The mud brick houses of the village stood close together, their flat roofs almost touching. In the early morning, neighbors would call softly to each other as they began their day. Women carried water jars on their shoulders, following the same worn paths their mothers had walked. The smell of baking bread drifted from one courtyard to another, mixing with the scent of dried fish and onions. Everyone knew their role in the community. The potter shaped vessels while his neighbor wove baskets from papyrus reeds. Children ran between the houses, their voices echoing off the walls as they played. When someone fell ill, the whole village noticed. Neighbors would bring food and offer help with the fields. During harvest time, families worked side by side in the barley fields. They shared tools and labor, moving from one plot to the next. In the evenings, people gathered in the largest courtyard to rest. They spoke of the river's level, the health of the crops, and news from nearby settlements. The village scribe might read official announcements while others mended fishing nets or ground grain. This closeness brought both comfort and obligation, binding each person to their neighbors through countless daily exchanges. The morning air would already be warming as families gathered near the communal oven at the edge of the courtyard. Each household brought their shaped loaves, marked with their own small signs pressed into the dough. The oven keeper, usually an older woman who knew exactly how hot the clay walls needed to be, would arrange the breads with practiced hands. Children would play nearby while their mothers talked quietly, sharing news from the market or discussing the water levels in the canals. The smell of baking grain filled the air, mixing with the smoke that drifted lazily upward. Some families brought beer jars to warm near the oven's base, the thick liquid slowly bubbling as the heat reached through the pottery. When disputes arose about whose turn it was or how much space each family could use, the oven keeper would settle matters with a few firm words. Her authority came from years of tending the fire, knowing which would burn cleanest, how to bank the coals for even heat. By mid-morning, families would return home carrying their warm breads wrapped in linen. the golden loaves still radiating heat against their arms as they walked through the narrow village paths. The morning air carried the scent of baking bread through every village along the Nile. In courtyards and small kitchens, women knelt beside clay ovens, their hands working steadily through mounds of barley and emmer wheat dough. The rhythm of kneading became part of the day's heartbeat, as constant as the river's flow. Each household kept their grinding stones close. The sound of stone against grain filled the early hours, a low rumbling that mixed with the calls of ibis, birds greeting the dawn. Children often helped, their small hands learning to feel when the flour was fine enough, when water needed adding, when the dough had risen properly in the warmth. The ovens themselves were simple clay structures, but they held the day's most important work. Flatbreads emerged first, still soft and steaming. Round loaves followed, their crusts golden in the morning light. Some families added dates or herbs, creating variations that marked special occasions, or simply brightened an ordinary meal. By the time the sun climbed higher, fresh bread cooled on reed mats. The smell lingered in the air, a promise that the household was fed, that life continued its steady cycle along the river's edge. The morning light would find women and children making their way down the worn paths to the river's edge. They carried clay vessels on their heads or shoulders, moving with practiced balance. The Nile's water was life itself, flowing brown with fertile silt during the flood season, clearer during the dry months. Those who lived farther from the river drew their water from wells dug deep into the earth. The rope would creak as the leather bucket descended into the darkness below, then emerged, dripping and full. In larger households, servants performed this task many times each day, filling great storage jars that stood in the coolest corners of the courtyard. The water carriers developed their own rhythms. They knew which spots along the riverbank offered the cleanest water, away from where the cattle came to drink. They learned to time their journeys for the cooler hours, when the clay jars wouldn't dry out so quickly in the heat. Some sang quietly as they walked, their voices mixing with the gentle slosh of water against clay. Back in the villages, the filled jars would rest in the shade, their damp surfaces cooling the precious water within through the long, warm afternoon. Down by the river, the morning air carried the steady rhythm of washing. Women gathered at the water's edge, their baskets filled with linens and clothing. The Nile's current ran cool and constant, perfect for the day's work ahead. They worked in small groups, kneeling on smooth stones, worn flat by generations of washers before them. Each piece of fabric was soaked in the flowing water, then beaten against the rocks to loosen dirt and stains. The sound echoed softly across the riverbank, a familiar percussion that marked the early hours. Between the washing and beating, they would rub natron salt into stubborn spots. This natural mineral, gathered from dried lake beds, helped brighten the white linen that everyone wore. The work required patience and strength, especially with the heavier cloths used for household purposes. As the sun climbed higher, cleaned garments were spread across nearby bushes and flat rocks to dry. The desert heat would do its work quickly, leaving the fabric fresh and ready. By midday, the washerwomen would gather their dried linens, the day's labor complete, and make their way back to the village with baskets balanced carefully on their heads. The clay doll fits perfectly in small hands, its simple form shaped by a mother's fingers and left to dry in the afternoon sun. In the courtyards of mud brick homes, children gather with their treasures, wooden spinning tops that whirl across the packed earth, leather balls stuffed with papyrus scraps, miniature boats carved from sycamore wood. These toys carried the warmth of the hands that made them. Near the river's edge, a group of children races there. Toy boats in the shallows, each one different, some painted with red ochre, others left plain with tiny linen sails. The winners shout while the losers wade in to retrieve their vessels for another race. In quieter moments, girls cradle their dolls made of linen rags and river clay, whispering to them the same lullabies their mothers sing each night. Boys practice with miniature bows, their arrows tipped with blunted reeds, aiming at targets drawn in the dust. Even the simplest toys spark elaborate games. A stick becomes a farmer's tool. Smooth pebbles transform into herds of cattle, and acacia pods serve as rattles for the youngest ones. As evening approaches, these small objects are gathered up, waiting for tomorrow's play to begin again. In the homes along the Nile, cats moved through doorways with quiet authority. They belonged here as much as the clay pots or the grinding stones. The Egyptians kept them close, these small hunters who protected grain stores from mice and rats. A cat might stretch out on a sun-warmed mud brick wall during the heat of midday, or curl beside a child sleeping on a reed mat when darkness fell. Dogs lived differently. They walked beside their owners through the dusty streets, followed fishing boats along the river, and slept in courtyards under the stars. Some were sleek and tall, bred for hunting in the desert margins. Others were smaller, with curled tails and pointed ears, keeping watch over households. The tomb paintings show them clearly: dogs sitting beneath their owners' chairs at feasts, or running ahead during marsh hunts. Both animals received names, were mourned when they died, and sometimes were wrapped in linen for burial. In this world where the divine touched everyday life, cats connected to the goddess Bastet, while dogs accompanied the dead on their journey westward. Yet beyond these sacred associations, they were simply companions, sharing the rhythms of daily life along the river. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the air still held the coolness of night, cats moved through Egyptian homes with careful steps. These sleek creatures had found their place in the rhythm of daily life, settling into granaries and storage rooms where precious grain lay waiting for the next harvest season. The relationship between people and cats grew from necessity. Each household stored barley and emmer wheat in large clay jars, sustenance that needed to last through the months when the Nile's waters receded. Mice and rats threatened these stores, gnawing through baskets and contaminating what families needed to survive. But cats, with their patient hunting and watchful presence, kept these pests at bay. Farmers welcomed cats into their storage buildings, leaving small openings in the walls for them to pass through. The cats would spend their nights prowling between the grain jars, their eyes catching the faint moonlight as they tracked the smallest movements. By morning, evidence of their work could be found in the courtyard. This natural partnership required no training or commands. The cats simply lived alongside the people, drawn by warmth and shelter, while the humans gained protection for their most essential resource. The household stirred before dawn. In the mudbrick home near Memphis, the eldest daughter ground barley on the stone quern, while her mother tended the bread oven in the courtyard. The rhythmic scraping of stone on grain created a steady morning sound that drifted through the small windows. The father and sons had already left for the fields, carrying water jars and simple tools. During harvest season, every pair of hands mattered. The youngest children stayed home, learning their future roles by watching and helping. A boy of 6 practiced weaving reed baskets while his sister spun flax into thread, her small fingers working the spindle with growing skill. By midday, when the sun grew fierce, the family gathered in the shaded central room. They shared bread, onions, and beer, passing a single cup between them. The grandmother told stories while mending a torn linen tunic. Each person knew their tasks, passed down through generations like the copper cooking pot blackened with age. When evening came, they worked by oil lamplight. The mother prepared tomorrow's bread dough while the children cleaned grain. Their movements were practiced and sure, each family member a necessary part of the household's daily rhythm. In the villages along the Nile, marriage came quietly, without grand ceremonies or temple rituals. A man would bring gifts to a woman's family, simple offerings, like linen or grain, and if accepted, the couple would begin their life together. There were no priests to bless the union, no sacred vows spoken before the gods. The woman would gather her belongings and move to her husband's home, and with that they were married. This partnership was built on daily needs and shared work. The husband tended the fields or practiced his craft, while the wife managed the household, ground grain into flour, and wove cloth for their clothing. They worked side by side during harvest time, their children playing in the shade of date palms nearby. Property could be owned by either spouse, and women kept control of their dowries throughout the marriage. When evening came, they might sit together outside their mud brick home, watching boats drift past on the river. Their partnership was measured not in romance, but in reliability, in knowing that tomorrow's bread would be baked and the fields would be tended. In this practical arrangement, many couples found a quiet contentment that lasted through the seasons of the flood. In the villages along the Nile, a woman named Nebet might have owned the bakery where neighbors gathered each morning. She inherited the building from her mother, just as her daughter would one day inherit it from her. The papyrus deed bore her name alone, witnessed by the local scribe and sealed with her personal mark. Women managed workshops, supervised workers, and negotiated prices in the marketplace. They could buy and sell land, loan money, and appear in court to defend their interests. A wealthy widow might own several properties scattered through the town, collecting rent from tenants who paid in grain or copper weights. The law protected these rights. Marriage contracts often specified what property belonged to the wife before the wedding, ensuring it remained hers. If the marriage ended, she took her possessions with her. Some women became quite prosperous, their names appearing in temple records as donors of gold and fine linens. This independence shaped daily life in practical ways. A woman could decide to expand her weaving business, hire more workers, or trade her surplus cloth for imported goods. Her success depended on her skill and judgment, not on having a husband's permission. In the warm corners of Egyptian homes, midwives moved with practiced hands and quiet confidence. These women carried generations of knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, through countless births along the Nile. When labor pains began, families would send for the local midwife, who arrived with her simple tools and herbs, wrapped in linen cloth. The birthing room filled with soft voices and the scent of burning incense. Midwives guided mothers through each wave of pain, their steady presence bringing comfort in those long hours. They knew which positions eased the baby's journey, which herbs might help the process along, and which prayers to whisper to the goddess Torah, protector of childbirth. Between contractions, they would massage the mother's back with warm oils, their weathered hands strong and sure, The rhythm of their work followed the rhythm of life itself, unhurried and natural. When the baby finally arrived, the midwife would clean the infant with soft cloths, check for signs of health, and place the child in the mother's arms. Her work continued for days afterward, visiting the household to ensure both mother and baby thrived in those delicate first weeks of new life. In the early morning light along the Nile, a young mother cradles her newborn while her own mother sits beside her, showing her how to swaddle the baby in soft linen. The older woman's hands move with practiced ease, wrapping the cloth just tight enough to comfort but not restrict. She learned this from her mother, who learned it from hers. Each generation passing down the knowledge like water flowing from one vessel to another. Throughout the village, this pattern repeats itself. When a child falls ill with fever, neighbors gather with remedies made from honey and herbs. An aunt might bring a small amulet of Tauret, the protective goddess of childbirth and infants, while a grandmother prepares a soothing drink from crushed dates and goat's milk. No one needs to summon these women, they simply appear at the doorway, carrying their experience like gifts. The evening air fills with soft singing as mothers throughout the settlement rock their babies to sleep. These lullabies speak of the river's gentle current and the protection of the gods. Each woman knows the words because she heard them as a child, sung by voices now silent but somehow still present in the familiar melody. In the quiet hours before dawn, healers moved through their gardens, gathering leaves still wet with dew. The people of Egypt knew each plant by its scent and texture. Coriander seeds eased stomach troubles. Garlic helped ward off illness. Honey mixed with herbs created soothing balms for wounds. Every household kept bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Mothers taught daughters which roots to grind for headaches, which leaves too steep for fever. The knowledge passed down through generations, whispered from one pair of hands to the next. Along the Nile, wild plants grew in abundance. Villagers collected lotus flowers, not just for their beauty, but for their healing properties. Thyme grew in rocky soil, its tiny leaves holding powerful medicine. Even the common onion served as more than food. Temple healers worked with more complex mixtures. They combined ingredients in specific proportions, following recipes written on papyrus scrolls. The scent of frankincense and myrrh drifted from their workrooms. Patients arrived at first light, seeking relief from ailments that herbs might soothe. The healers listened carefully, selecting remedies with practiced care, their movements slow and deliberate in the morning stillness. The physician arrived at dawn, carrying his leather satchel of instruments and herbs. He knelt beside the sleeping mat where the patient lay, first checking the pulse at the wrist, then examining the eyes and tongue. His movements were deliberate and practiced, learned through years of study in the house of life attached to the temple. He mixed a remedy from willow bark and honey, grinding the ingredients together in a small stone bowl. As he worked, he spoke the words of healing that had been passed down through generations. Of physicians, the prayers were as essential as the medicine itself. Each treatment required both knowledge of the body and the proper invocations to the gods. The physician placed his hands on the patient's chest, feeling for heat and swelling. He applied a poultice of crushed herbs, wrapping it carefully. With linen strips between each layer, he recited the spell for driving out illness, his voice low and steady. The family watched from the doorway, trusting in his combination of practical skill and sacred knowledge. By midday, the treatment was complete, the prayers spoken, and the physician moved on to his next patient, following the same careful balance of medicine and ritual. Small objects of power hung from nearly every neck in Egypt. The scarab beetle carved from green stone, the eye of Horus shaped in faience, the Ankh symbol etched in copper. These amulets moved with their wearers through the day, catching the light as farmers bent over their fields, as scribes leaned over papyrus, as children played in the shade of mud brick walls. In the workshops of Memphis and Thebes, craftsmen shaped these protections with patient hands. They understood which symbols guarded against scorpion stings, which colors turned away the evil eye, which forms brought the favor of specific gods. A pregnant woman wore the image of Toret, the hippo goddess who watched over childbirth. A soldier carried the figure of Base, the dwarf god who fought off demons. Even the poorest farmer might wear a simple clay bead inscribed with a protective spell. The weight of these amulets was reassuring against the skin. They were touched throughout the day, a small comfort in uncertain moments. At night, they remained close to the body, their protection continuing through the vulnerable hours of sleep, when the soul was said to wander free from its earthly form. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the air along the Nile grew cool and still, many people in Egypt stirred from their sleep with vivid dreams fresh in their minds. These weren't just fleeting images to be forgotten with the morning light. Dreams held weight here, carried meaning that could shape the coming day. A farmer might wake from seeing his fields flooded with clear water and feel reassured about the harvest ahead. His wife, dreaming of broken pottery, would spend the next morning being especially careful with her water jars. They spoke of these visions over their morning bread, turning them over like smooth stones in their hands, searching for guidance. In the temples, priests kept records of significant dreams on papyrus scrolls. They understood patterns in these night visions, could read them like the seasonal rise and fall of the river. A merchant preparing for a journey down the Nile might seek their counsel after troubling dreams, hoping to understand whether the gods favored his plans. Even children learned early that the sleeping mind could receive whispers from beyond the waking world. The boundary between sleep and prophecy was as thin as morning mist over the water. As darkness settled over the Nile Valley each night, Egyptian households took careful measures to protect themselves during sleep. They understood that while the body rested, the soul could wander, leaving a person exposed to harmful spirits or nightmares sent by angry gods. Small clay lamps flickered beside sleeping mats, their gentle flames meant to ward off the creatures that moved through the night. Parents placed protective amulets beneath their children's headrests. These small charms, often shaped like the household god Base with his fierce face and lion's mane, stood guard while families slept. The wooden headrests themselves, carved with prayers and symbols, elevated the sleeper's head both for comfort and spiritual protection. In wealthier homes, priests might inscribe spells on bedroom walls, or place papyrus scrolls with protective writings near the bed. Common folk made do with simpler remedies. They might scatter herbs like coriander around their sleeping areas, or hang garlic near doorways. Some whispered evening prayers to Nut, the sky goddess who swallowed the sun each night and gave birth to it each morning, asking her to hold them safely in her starry embrace until dawn returned to the land. As the sun descended behind the western hills, the heat that had pressed down on the villages along the Nile began to lift. The mud brick walls of homes, which had absorbed the day's warmth, now released it slowly into the cooling air. Palm fronds rustled in the evening breeze that swept in from the river. The busy sounds of daily life faded as darkness settled over the land. No more grinding of grain, no hammering from the metal workers' quarter, no calls from merchants in the marketplace. Even the donkeys and cattle grew quiet in their pens. The streets that had bustled with workers, water carriers, and children now lay empty, except for the occasional guard making his rounds with a small oil lamp. Inside their homes, families gathered on flat rooftops where the air moved more freely. Some spread red mats and prepared to sleep under the stars. Others remained indoors, settling onto low platforms covered with linen. The night sounds were different now. A dog barking in the distance, the gentle lapping of the Nile against the shore, sometimes the call of a night bird, or the splash of a crocodile slipping into the water. This was the rhythm of night in Egypt, when the land rested and prepared for another day beneath the sun. As darkness settled over the villages along the Nile, the soft glow of oil lamps began to appear in doorways and windows. These simple clay vessels, shaped by local potters, held sesame oil or animal fat, with a twisted linen wick resting in the shallow pool. The flame was small but steady, casting warm shadows across mud brick walls. In modest homes, a single lamp might serve an entire family. Children would gather close to its light while their mother prepared the evening meal, the flickering flame just bright enough to see the grain being ground or the bread being shaped. Wealthier households possessed several lamps, some decorated with lotus patterns or images of protective deities. Servants would move through the rooms at dusk, lighting each one carefully, creating pools of golden light in the growing darkness. The scent of burning oil mixed with the cooler night air drifting in from the river. As the evening wore on, most lamps would be extinguished to conserve precious fuel. Perhaps one would remain burning through the night, a small beacon against the complete darkness, its gentle light watching over those who slept. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the guards took their positions at the city gates. These men carried simple spears and wore leather armor, standing watch through the long hours of darkness. Their presence was essential. Without them, the city would be vulnerable to thieves, wild animals, and raiders who might approach under cover of night. The guards worked in shifts, usually groups of 4 or 6 men. They built small fires near the gates, both for warmth and to see anyone approaching. The flickering light cast long shadows across the mud brick walls. Throughout the night they would call out to each other, confirming all was well. Their voices carried softly through the sleeping streets. During festivals or important ceremonies, the number of guards doubled. They checked travelers entering after dark, asking their business and examining any goods they carried. Most nights passed quietly. The guards would share bread and beer, telling stories to stay awake. When dawn approached and the first farmers began arriving with fresh produce, the night guards would hand over their duties to the day watch, returning home as the city slowly awakened around them. The priests climbed the temple stairs each night, their footsteps soft against the stone. Above them, the stars moved in their eternal patterns across the darkness. They carried papyrus scrolls and simple instruments, preparing to record what they saw in the hours before dawn. These watchers of the sky knew every constellation by name. They tracked the movement of Sapta, the bright star that announced the coming flood. When it appeared on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, the Nile would soon begin to rise. The farmers depended on these observations, planning their year around the celestial calendar the priests maintained. In the temple courtyards, Young scribes learned to read the night sky like a vast scroll. They memorized the 36 decans, the star groups that marked the passing hours of darkness. Water clocks dripped steadily beside them, helping measure time when clouds obscured the stars. The observations were practical, not mystical. The sky told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for the inundation. Every mark on their papyrus connected the heavens to the rhythms of daily life along the river. The stars were their clock, their calendar, their guide through the seasons. The night sky above Egypt was a map, written in light. Travelers crossing the desert would wait for darkness to reveal their guide. The North Star held steady while other stars wheeled slowly across the heavens, marking the hours and showing the way. Caravan leaders knew these patterns like old friends. They would rest during the scorching midday heat, then rise as twilight painted the sand purple and gold. As full darkness settled, the stars emerged one by one. First the brightest ones, then countless others, filling the dome above. The constellation they called the imperishable ones never dipped below the horizon. These stars circled the North Star. Throughout the night, reliable as the flooding of the Nile, desert guides would point their walking sticks toward these stars, setting their course across the vast expanses of sand. On calm nights, the stars seemed close enough to touch. Their light was strong in the clear desert air, casting faint shadows on the ground. Travelers would walk steadily through the cool darkness, their footsteps muffled by sand, following the ancient paths marked out by the stars above. The great temples along the Nile were positioned with careful attention to the movements of the sun and stars. At Karnak, the massive columns and corridors aligned precisely with the winter solstice sunrise, allowing Ra's first light to penetrate deep into the sanctuary. The builders watched the sky for years, marking where certain stars appeared on the horizon, using these celestial markers to guide their construction. Priests would stand in the courtyards at night, observing the slow wheel of constellations overhead. They knew that Sirius, the brightest star, disappeared for 70 days each year before returning just before the flood season. This knowledge shaped how they oriented the sacred buildings. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera faced the point where this star would rise, its light eventually touching the statue of the goddess within. Stone by stone, these structures took shape according to patterns written in the heavens. The workers who laid the foundations understood they were creating earthly mirrors of celestial order. In the pre-dawn darkness, as stars faded and the eastern sky grew pale, the temples stood ready to receive the first blessing of daylight. Their doorways and halls arranged to welcome the sun god home. The sun traced its path across the Egyptian sky, and with it came the gentle marking of ours. In temple courtyards, priests watched as shadows fell across stone sundials, the dark lines shifting slowly through the day. These shadow clocks divided daylight into 12 parts, each one flowing into the next as the sun moved overhead. When darkness came, or on cloudy days when shadows failed, the Egyptians turned to water. In great stone vessels, water dripped steadily through a small opening at the bottom. Marks carved inside the container showed how much time had passed as the water level dropped. Some temples kept elaborate water clocks with floating figures that rose and fell with the changing levels. Wealthy households might have smaller versions, though most people simply lived by the sun's rhythm. Workers in the fields knew when to rest by the length of their own shadows. craftsmen in workshops understood the passage of hours through the changing light that fell across their benches. Night brought its own timekeeping, as temple astronomers watched stars cross the sky, marking the hours of darkness for those who needed to know when dawn would come. When the sun reached its highest point in the Egyptian sky, the rhythm of daily life shifted. Workers in the fields set down their tools, craftsmen stepped away from their benches, and even the merchants in the market squares sought shelter. The heat during these midday hours was too intense for labor, turning the air thick and still. In the shade of mud brick homes and beneath canvas awnings, people rested. Some dozed on woven mats, while others sat quietly, conserving their energy. Children played simple games with stones, or listened to their grandparents tell stories. The wealthy retreated to the coolest rooms of their houses, where servants fanned the air with large palm fronds. This pause was not laziness, but wisdom passed down through generations. The body needed rest during the peak heat to maintain strength for the remaining work. As the sun began its descent and shadows grew longer, life would stir again. Tools would be picked up, conversations would resume, and the steady rhythm of Egyptian labor would continue until darkness fell. The day was long, but these quiet hours in the middle provided essential relief from the demanding sun. The sun climbed high above the village, and the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. Workers in the fields set aside their tools and made their way back to their homes. The intense midday sun made labor impossible, and everyone understood this natural rhythm of the day. Inside the mud brick houses, families gathered in the coolest rooms. Reed mats were unrolled on the floor, and people settled down for their afternoon rest. Children curled up beside their mothers while men stretched out in shaded corners. Even the household cats found spots away from the burning light streaming through small windows. The village grew quiet during these hours. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of palm fronds and the occasional breeze and the distant murmur of the Nile. Merchants closed their stalls in the market square. Potters abandoned their wheels. Weavers set down their threads. This pause in the day's activities was essential. The body needed time to escape the scorching heat that could drain a person's strength. As shadows lengthened and the air began to cool, the village would slowly wake again. Tools would be picked up, work resumed, and life would continue until the blessed coolness of evening arrived. The limestone blocks arrived at dawn, carried on wooden sledges from the quarries upriver. Teams of 20 men worked together, their movements coordinated by the rhythm of chanted work songs. Each team had its own name painted on pottery shards: the strong arms of Ra, the mighty builders of Memphis. These weren't slaves but paid laborers who took pride in their craft. During the flood season, when farming ceased, thousands of workers gathered at construction sites. They lived in purpose-built villages near the monuments, sleeping in mud brick barracks arranged in neat rows. The Pharaohs' administrators provided their daily bread, rations, onions, garlic, and beer. Medical priests tended injuries. Scribes recorded each team's progress on papyrus scrolls. The work was hard but organized. Stone setters positioned blocks, while rope pullers hauled materials up earthen ramps. Water carriers kept the mud slick beneath the sledges. Team leaders wore white headbands to distinguish themselves, calling out instructions as the sun tracked across the sky. At sunset, the workers returned to their quarters, muscles aching, knowing their labor served both the pharaoh and the gods, who watched over Egypt's eternal monuments. In the workshops near the quarries, stone carvers worked with patient precision. Each morning, they would arrive as the first light touched the limestone cliffs, their tools wrapped in leather pouches. The master carvers had spent years learning their craft, starting as young apprentices who first learned to polish rough surfaces and sharpen chisels. The work demanded both strength and delicacy. A carver would study the stone's natural grain, running weathered fingers along its surface to understand where it would yield and where it might resist. With bronze chisels and wooden mallets, they would begin their slow transformation of raw rock into sacred images. The rhythm of metal against stone created a steady heartbeat through the workshop yards. Different stones required different approaches. The soft limestone from Tura could be shaped with relative ease, while the harder granite from Aswan demanded more time and stronger tools. Master carvers knew these differences intimately. They passed this knowledge to their apprentices through years of careful instruction, teaching them how to read the stone's language and respond with appropriate technique. In this way, the ancient art continued from one generation to the next. In the limestone hills beyond the villages, tomb painters worked by the light of oil lamps. Their workshops echoed with the soft scratch of brushes against stone walls. These artisans spent their days creating images that would surround the deceased for eternity. The painters ground their pigments each morning: red ochre from the desert, malachite for green, charcoal for black. They mixed these colors with egg whites and tree gum, creating paints that would endure for thousands of years. The tomb walls had been carefully smoothed and covered with a thin layer of plaster, ready for decoration. Each scene followed established patterns. The tomb owner might be shown receiving offerings, sailing on the Nile, or overseeing the harvest of their fields. Birds flew through papyrus marshes. Fish swam beneath boats. Servants carried platters of bread and jars of beer. Every detail mattered, for these paintings were meant to provide for the deceased in the afterlife. The work progressed slowly in the dim underground chambers. Artists painted from ceiling to floor, their steady hands bringing life to the walls. The finished tombs became galleries of daily life, preserving forever the world the departed had known. The tomb paintings reveal how Egyptians wanted to remember their days. Here we see a nobleman's morning routine painted in careful detail. He sits while servants bring water for washing, each figure positioned just so. The artist shows every person at their best: skin smooth, bodies strong, movements graceful. In another scene, the same man inspects his fields. The farmers stand in neat rows, their tools gleaming. The cattle appear fat and healthy. The grain grows tall and golden. No one sweats in the painted sun, no one stumbles or grows tired. The overseer's face shows satisfaction, not worry. Every harvest brings abundance. The artists who created these scenes knew real life held more struggle. They saw tired workers and thin cattle. They knew failed harvests and difficult seasons. But in the tomb, life becomes perfect. The deceased would see himself forever young, forever successful, surrounded by plenty. His family appears beautiful and devoted. His servants work with joy. These painted walls served as windows into an eternal life where nothing goes wrong. The colors stay bright, the food never spoils. The river always provides. This careful perfection gave comfort to those who gazed upon these scenes, knowing their loved ones would dwell in such a world forever. Inside the tomb chambers, artists painted loaves of bread onto the walls with careful strokes. Each grain pattern received attention, each crust rendered in ochre and brown. These were not decorations. These were provisions for eternity. The painters understood their work differently than those who prepared actual food. A real loaf would crumble to dust within days, but their painted bread would feed the deceased forever. They mixed their pigments with precision, knowing these colors would outlast generations of harvests along the Nile. On one wall, they might paint jars of beer, showing the foam at the rim. On another, roasted ducks arranged on platters, their skin golden brown. Figs and dates filled painted bowls. Fish lay garnished with herbs that would never wilt. The artists captured the moment when food looked most appealing, most nourishing, and held it there in mineral and gum. Families who could not afford to keep bringing fresh offerings took comfort in these painted feasts. The images would sustain their loved ones when the offering table stood empty. The eternal meal waited on the walls, ready whenever hunger stirred in the afterlife. The preparation of the dead was a careful process that unfolded over 70 days. In the workshops near the temples, specialists worked in quiet concentration, their movements practiced and deliberate. The air carried the scent of natron salt and cedar oil, while linen strips lay stacked in neat piles along wooden shelves. The embalmers moved through their tasks with steady hands. They wrapped the body in layer after layer of fine linen, placing protective amulets between the folds. Each piece had its proper position, each wrapping its particular method. The work required patience and precision, as every detail mattered for the journey ahead. Outside these workshops, families gathered the items their loved ones would need: clay vessels for water and beer, wooden models of servants, small loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. These objects would accompany the deceased into the afterlife, ensuring comfort and provision. The wealthy might commission elaborate furniture and golden jewelry, while modest families offered what they could. The entire process reflected a deep belief that death was not an ending, but a transition. Every action, from the first washing to the final seal on the tomb, served to prepare the departed for their eternal life along the celestial Nile. The embalmers worked in quiet workshops along the western bank of the Nile, where the sun descended each evening into the realm of the dead. Their hands moved with practiced care, treating each body as a sacred vessel that would carry the person into eternity. The process took 70 days, matching the time that Sirius, the brightest star, disappeared from the night sky before its rebirth. In the first days, they removed the organs carefully, placing them in canopic jars watched over by protective gods. The heart remained in place, for it would be weighed against a feather in the hall of judgment. Salt from the desert dried the body slowly, drawing out moisture while priests recited spells that would help the deceased navigate the dangerous journey ahead. The linen wrappings came from temple workshops, where women wove the finest cloth by oil lamplight. Layer upon layer, the embalmers wrapped the body, tucking small amulets between the bandages, a scarab beetle over the heart, an eye of Horus for protection. Each charm had its purpose, its place in the great transformation. Outside, the stars turned overhead, marking the passage of another soul preparing for its eternal journey along the river of the sky. The wooden boats moved slowly along the river as morning light touched the water. Professional mourners walked along the banks, their voices carrying across the reeds in practiced rhythms. The deceased lay within the cabin, wrapped in linen, surrounded by possessions for the journey ahead. Family members followed in smaller vessels, their white garments bright against the green banks. The procession passed villages where daily life continued. Farmers looked up from their fields, Children paused in their games. Women at the washing stones stood still for a moment. The boats moved westward, always westward, toward the setting sun and the land of the dead. At designated points along the journey, the boats would pause. Priests performed rituals, pouring water from the Nile, offering bread and beer. The professional mourners increased their lamentations, their movements choreographed through generations of practice. These women knew every gesture, every cry that tradition demanded. The journey might take hours or days, depending on the distance to the tomb. The river carried them all, as it carried everything in Egypt. The same water that brought life to the fields now bore the dead to their eternal homes. The workers carried small wooden chests into the tomb chamber, their footsteps muffled by the sand-covered floor. Each chest held the items their owner had touched every day: a favorite comb made from ivory, a bronze mirror polished until it caught, the light sandals worn soft from walking along the river paths. These weren't ceremonial objects, but the simple tools of daily life. A scribe's palette rested beside rolls of papyrus, the ink cakes still showing the grooves where water had been mixed. Gaming boards waited with their playing pieces arranged. For the next match, linen tunics lay folded, the same ones worn during cool morning walks through the fields. Even cosmetic jars found their place, filled with the coal and oils that had been morning rituals. The placement followed careful patterns. Food jars stood near the entrance, bread dried, fish, dates preserved in honey. Furniture pieces recreated familiar spaces, a low stool, a headrest carved from wood. These belongings would continue their service in the next world, where days would unfold much like they had beside the Nile. The tomb became a quiet echo of the life that had been lived above. The tomb paintings show families gathered around tables laden with bread and beer, just as they would have been in life. The deceased are shown wearing their finest linen, tending to fields of wheat that never fail, sailing boats on rivers that never run dry. This was how they understood what came after death, not as an ending, but as a familiar continuation. In the workshops where coffins were painted and amulets carved, artisans depicted the same daily activities that filled their own lives. They painted farmers with their oxen, women grinding grain, children playing by the water's edge. The afterlife they created with their brushes was simply their own world perfected. The floods would always come at the right time. The harvests would always be abundant. The beer jars would never empty. When families placed food offerings in the tombs, fresh bread, dried fish, clay, vessels of beer, they were providing for a journey they understood. The dead would need sustenance, just as the living did. They would need clothing and sandals, cosmetics and combs. They would want to feel the sun on their faces and the cool north wind in the evening. Death was a departure, yes, but to a place remarkably like home. The afterlife fields stretched endlessly before the departed, green and abundant as the richest plots along the Nile during the inundation. Here in the field of reeds, wheat grew tall without effort, and barley swayed in a breeze that never ceased. The deceased would work these lands, but the labor brought no exhaustion. Seeds planted themselves, water flowed through channels that never needed clearing, and every harvest yielded grain of perfect quality. The soil felt soft beneath their feet, dark and rich as the silt that blessed Egypt each year. Palm trees provided shade where it was needed, their fronds rustling with the same sound that had comforted them in life. The irrigation ditches ran clear and straight, carrying water that sparkled like the river at dawn. In these eternal fields, the deceased performed the same tasks they had known since childhood: sowing, tending, reaping. But here the work held a different rhythm, peaceful and unhurried. This vision of paradise reflected what mattered most to those who had spent their days cultivating the earth. The afterlife promised not leisure, but the continuation of meaningful work, in a place where the harvest would always be bountiful. When someone passed away in Egypt, their journey was far from over. The body would be carefully prepared, wrapped in linen, and placed in a tomb. But the most important moment was yet to come. Deep within the realm of the dead, in a great hall of judgment, the deceased would stand before 42 divine judges. The air in that hall was still and heavy with anticipation. At the center of this ceremony stood a great balance scale. On one side, the scribes would place the person's heart, preserved within their body during mummification. This heart contained every deed, every kindness, every wrongdoing of their lifetime. On the other side of the scale rested a single ostrich feather, the feather of Mat, representing truth and justice. The scale would tip one way or another, revealing the weight of a life lived. If the heart balanced perfectly with the feather, the person could continue their journey into the peaceful fields of reeds, where they would farm and feast forever. But if the heart proved heavy with misdeeds, a creature waited in the shadows. The Egyptians prepared for this moment throughout their lives, learning the proper words to speak, the right prayers to offer, hoping their hearts would be light enough when their time came. The weighing of the heart stood at the center of every Egyptian life. In the Hall of Two Truths, the deceased would face 42 judges, each listening for specific wrongdoings. The heart, placed on golden scales, would be measured against the feather of Mat, goddess of truth and justice. A heart heavy with misdeeds would tip the scales, and the soul would face destruction. A heart light with righteousness would pass into the eternal fields. This knowledge shaped daily choices in villages along the Nile. A farmer might return extra grain, accidentally given at market. A scribe would resist altering records for personal gain. Children learned early that stealing figs from a neighbor's tree added weight to their hearts. Even private thoughts mattered, for the gods saw all. In temple schools, young priests memorized the negative confessions they would one day speak before the judges. I have not caused pain. I have not made anyone weep. I have not killed. These weren't mere words, but guidelines for living. At night, families would gather to hear stories of those who lived justly and found paradise, where the wheat grew taller than any man and cool breezes always blew. The tombs beneath the sand hold more than bodies. Within these chambers, carefully arranged beside the deceased, rest the objects of daily life. A farmer's hoe lies next to his wrapped form, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of work in the fields. Beside it, a sickle waits, as if tomorrow he might rise to harvest barley under the morning sun. Linen garments, folded with care, fill wooden chests. The finest robes a person owned now accompany them on their journey westward. A merchant's scales rest near his head. A scribe's palette and brushes lie within reach of still hands. These are not mere possessions, but extensions of who these people were in life. The practice extends beyond the wealthy. Even modest burials contain a few precious items. A mother's spindle, a fisherman's net waits, a child's wooden toy. Each object speaks of the life lived and the belief that such a life continues elsewhere. In the darkness of these tombs, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the clothes they wore. The dead wait patiently. The items around them promise that when they wake in the next world, they will find everything familiar, everything needed to begin again. The path to the necropolis stretched westward from the village, worn smooth by countless feet over generations. On festival days and quiet afternoons alike, families made their way to the tombs of their ancestors, carrying small offerings wrapped in linen cloth. Children walked beside their parents, learning the route they would one day teach their own children. At the tomb entrance, the family would pause. The eldest would speak the names of the dead, a ritual as natural as breathing. Inside the small chapel area, they placed fresh bread, beer, and flowers on the offering table. The walls showed painted scenes of the deceased receiving these gifts in the afterlife, their forms forever young and strong. These visits weren't somber occasions. Families shared meals near the tombs, telling stories about the departed, keeping their memory alive through words. The dead were not gone but transformed, still part of the family circle. Letters written on pottery shards were sometimes left behind, updating the deceased on family news, asking for their blessing on marriages or births. As the sun moved lower, casting long shadows across the desert, the families would return home, knowing they would come again. The bond between the living and the dead remained unbroken, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. The tomb sealed, the family's work had only begun. Each morning, relatives would walk the dusty paths to the necropolis, carrying fresh bread and jugs of beer. These offerings sustained the Ka, the life force that remained with the body, while the Ba journeyed through the underworld. In wealthy households, priests performed these duties daily. They entered the offering chapel through painted doorways, speaking the deceased's name, allowed to keep their memory alive. The ritual words floated through the still air as they placed food before the false door, that magical threshold between worlds. Water poured onto offering tables, bread arranged in neat rows, incense smoke curling upward in the lamplight. For common folk, the visits came less frequently. On festival days, families gathered at simple mud brick mastabas, sharing meals with their departed. Children learned these duties young, understanding that one day they too would make these walks, speak these words. The cycle continued generation after generation, binding the living to the dead through daily acts of remembrance. Even the poorest families found ways to honor their dead, knowing that to be forgotten was the true death. The Nile's rhythm shaped everything. When the river began to rise in summer, the flooding season arrived, transforming the landscape into a vast, shimmering lake. Fields disappeared beneath the waters. Bred before small shrines, these offerings kept the connection between the living and the dead strong. A grandmother's name might be whispered as her recipe was prepared. A father's tools were kept oiled and ready, as if he might return to use them. In the villages along the Nile, children learned the genealogies of their families, reciting names back through generations. The dead were not gone but transformed, living in the field of reeds, where they continued their work under perfect skies. Letters were sometimes written to deceased relatives, asking for guidance or blessing. These papyrus notes were left at tomb entrances or burned so the smoke could carry the words westward. During festivals, empty chairs were set at tables for those who had died. Their favorite foods were served. Their preferred songs were sung. The boundary between this world and the next was thin, maintained through daily acts of remembrance. Even modest tombs received their share of offerings, ensuring no soul went hungry in the eternal lands beyond the western horizon. The names of those who had passed were spoken aloud in homes throughout Egypt. Each morning, as sunlight touched the mud brick walls, families would pour water in place, and farmers turned to other work, repairing tools, weaving baskets, or laboring on temple construction projects. The air grew heavy with moisture, and mosquitoes hummed through the humid nights. As the waters receded, the growing season began. The flood left behind rich, dark soil that clung to farmers' feet. As they scattered barley and emmer wheat seeds across the damp earth, children helped scare birds away from the newly planted fields, while their parents tended irrigation channels. The cool morning air carried the earthy scent of wet soil. The harvest season brought its own urgency. Golden grain swayed in the dry wind as families worked from dawn until dusk, cutting stalks with curved sickles. The rhythmic sound of threshing filled the air, cattle treading grain while workers tossed it with wooden forks. Tax collectors watched carefully, recording each farmer's yield on papyrus scrolls. Granaries slowly filled with the year's abundance, insurance against lean times ahead. When the Nile began to rise each summer, the fields along its banks disappeared beneath the spreading waters. The flood arrived like a slow, inevitable guest, turning the valley into a vast, calm lake that stretched from village to village. Farmers watched from higher ground as their plots vanished under the gentle current, knowing this annual drowning brought life, not destruction. For 3 to 4 months, the usual rhythms of plowing and planting ceased. The flood season created its own tempo. Men who normally spent dawn to dusk in the fields found themselves with different tasks. Some joined construction crews, hauling limestone blocks for temples or tombs. Others repaired tools, mended irrigation channels, or wove new baskets for the coming harvest. In the villages, life continued at a quieter pace. Women ground grain stores from the previous harvest. Children played along the waters. Edge and elders shared stories in the shade. The air hung heavy with moisture, and the afternoon heat pressed down more gently than during planting season. Evenings brought cool breezes off the water, carrying the earthy scent of rich silt, settling slowly onto the submerged land. The fields stretched golden beneath the sun as harvest time arrived along the Nile. Every household member had their role when the grain stood ready. Men moved through the barley with curved sickles, cutting close to the ground in steady rhythm. Women followed behind, gathering the stalks into bundles that children carried to the threshing floors. The work began before dawn and continued until the heat grew too strong. Farmers sang together as they moved through the rows, their voices carrying across the flatlands. The songs helped maintain the pace and lift tired spirits during the long days of cutting at the threshing grounds. Oxen walked in circles, their hooves separating grain from stalk. Workers used wooden forks to toss the mixture into the air, letting the wind carry away the chaff. The precious kernels fell to the ground, ready for collection and measurement. Tax collectors waited nearby with their scribes, recording each farmer's yield. A portion went to the temples, another to the royal granaries. What remained would sustain families through the coming year. As evening approached, workers shared bread and beer, their bodies exhausted but their stores beginning to fill. The threshing floors spread across the village edges, circular patches of hard-packed earth where the harvest came to rest. Oxen moved in slow circles, their hooves pressing through layers of wheat stalks. The steady rhythm of their movement filled the warm afternoon air, round and round beneath the Egyptian sun. Farmers guided the animals with gentle calls, watching as the heavy feet separated grain from stalk. Sometimes donkeys joined the work, their smaller hooves requiring more passes over the golden spread. The animals knew this routine well, having walked these same circles season after season. Children sat in the shade nearby, weaving simple baskets while keeping watch over the working beasts. When an ox slowed, they would offer it water from clay vessels, running their small hands along its dusty flanks. The grain beneath gradually loosened, kernels falling free from their protective husks. As the sun moved lower, the threshing neared completion. Workers would soon arrive with winnowing fans, tossing the mixture into the evening breeze to separate wheat from chaff. But for now, the oxen continued their patient circles, the sound of their breathing mixing with the soft crushing of straw, creating the gentle soundtrack of harvest time along the Nile. The heat of the Egyptian sun served many purposes beyond warming the land. In every household, from the simplest mud brick home to the estates of nobles, people understood how to work with nature to keep their food from spoiling. Fish caught from the Nile would be cleaned and laid out on reed mats, where the dry desert air would pull the moisture from the flesh, preserving it for weeks to come. In the courtyard, clay jars stood in neat rows, their contents protected by layers of salt, harvested from the edges of distant lakes. Meat from ducks and geese would rest in these vessels, slowly curing in the mineral embrace. The same salt that preserved their food would one day preserve their bodies for the afterlife, though this connection went unspoken in daily conversation. Women ground grain in the cool hours before dawn, storing the flour in sealed containers away from moisture. They knew that honey, gathered from hives kept in cylindrical clay tubes, would never spoil. Date cakes wrapped in palm leaves could travel with merchants down the river for days without decay. The rhythm of preservation followed the rhythm of the seasons, each family maintaining their stores with quiet efficiency. Along the banks of the Nile, date palms swayed in the warm breeze, their fronds creating patches of welcome shade. These trees were treasures to the Egyptian people, offering sweet fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried for the months ahead. Children would climb the tall trunks, their small hands reaching for the clusters of golden brown dates, hanging high above the ground. In the gardens behind mud brick homes, fig trees grew heavy with fruit. The figs ripened in the heat, their purple skins splitting slightly to reveal the sweet flesh inside. Women gathered them in woven baskets during the cool morning hours, before the sun climbed high. Some figs were eaten immediately, their honey-like sweetness a simple pleasure after the morning's work. Others were carefully laid out on reed mats to dry in the sun, where they would shrivel into concentrated sweetness that could last through the inundation season. Both fruits appeared at market stalls, piled in ceramic bowls or strung together for easy carrying. Workers received figs and dates as part of their rations, and temple offerings often included these fruits, alongside bread and beer. The natural sugars provided energy for long days of labor under the Egyptian sun. In the warm kitchens of Egypt, honey was the golden treasure that sweetened daily life. Beekeepers tended their clay hives along the Nile's edges, where wildflowers bloomed in abundance. The bees worked steadily through the hot days, gathering nectar from acacia blossoms and wild thyme. When harvest time came, the beekeepers would calm their charges with smoke from dried dung, moving slowly and carefully to collect the precious combs. The honey flowed thick and amber, stored in sealed pottery jars to keep through the seasons. Cooks reached for these jars when preparing festival cakes, mixing the honey with dates and flour, shaping the dough into spirals and crescents. In noble households, honey glazed roasted ducks and sweetened wine at evening banquets. Common families treasured their smaller portions, adding drops to barley porridge or spreading it on flatbread for special occasions. Children would sometimes find small honey cakes left as offerings at household shrines, the sweet scent mixing with incense in the morning air. Even physicians kept honey in their stores, mixing it with herbs for soothing throat remedies. This simple sweetness from the hive touched every corner of Egyptian life, from the grandest feast to the humblest meal. In the villages along the Nile, the morning routine began with the pouring of beer. Every household kept clay jars filled with this thick, cloudy brew that tasted faintly of bread and dates. Children received their portions in small cups, while adults filled larger vessels for the day ahead. The brewers worked in the courtyard, grinding barley between stones and mixing it with water from special storage jars. The mixture fermented for days in the warm Egyptian air, bubbling quietly in the shade. Women supervised this process carefully, tasting and adjusting, knowing that good beer meant healthy families. At construction sites and in the fields, workers paused regularly to drink from shared pottery vessels. The beer was nutritious and filling, part of their daily wages alongside bread and onions. Even the smallest farming hamlet had someone skilled in brewing, their knowledge passed down through generations. The Nile flowed brown with silt, especially during the inundation season. People understood that Bayer, with its controlled preparation and fermentation, provided sustenance they could trust. In the evening, families gathered to share their meal. Clay cups of beer, catching the last light of day as conversation drifted into the cooling air. The evening meal brought families together as daylight softened over the village. Inside mud brick homes, mothers and daughters arranged pottery bowls on low tables, while the scent of baking bread drifted from clay ovens. Fathers returned from fields or workshops, washing dust from their hands in water basins near the doorway. Everyone sat cross-legged on woven mats, sharing from common dishes. Children learned to tear bread with their right hand, using it to scoop lentil stew or vegetables. Parents passed dates and figs between siblings, ensuring each child received their portion. The youngest might sit in a parent's lap, receiving small bites of softened bread dipped in beer or milk. Conversation flowed quietly as they ate. A father might describe the progress of barley in the fields. A mother could mention plans for tomorrow's weaving. Older children shared stories from their day helping neighbors or playing by the canal. These simple exchanges wove the fabric of family life, teaching children about work, community, and their place within both. As oil lamps cast warm shadows on the walls, the meal ended with shared water from a single cup, passed hand to hand in the fading light. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, the rhythm of the village shifted. Workers in the fields gathered their tools, wiping sweat from their brows as the heat finally began to ease. The potter's wheel slowed its spinning, and the last vessels of the day were set aside to dry. Along the riverbank, fishermen pulled their reed boats onto shore, their catches already clean and prepared for the evening meal. The golden light transformed mud brick walls into warm amber surfaces. Children who had spent the afternoon playing near the canal paths now walked home, their voices growing quieter as shadows lengthened. Women returned from the river with water jars balanced on their hips, their steps measured and steady on the familiar paths. In the workshops, craftsmen set down their copper tools and covered their work. The scribe rolled his papyrus carefully, placing it in its wooden case. Even the grinding stones fell silent as grain preparations ceased for the day. The air itself seemed to settle, carrying the scent of cooking fires beginning to bloom across the village. This daily transition brought its own gentle certainty, as reliable as the river's flow. When darkness settled over the villages along the Nile, workers returned from the fields and quarries. The day's labor showed in their movements, slow steps through doorways, hands brushing dust from linen kilts. Inside mud brick homes, oil lamps cast soft shadows on whitewashed walls. Farmers set down their tools in corners. Stone carvers placed chisels carefully on shelves. The rhythm of work gave way to evening routines. Water from clay jars cooled sun-warmed skin. Families gathered on flat rooftops where the night air moved more freely than in the rooms below. The physical toll of the day was real. Backs ached from bending over crops. Arms were heavy from lifting water from irrigation channels. Yet this fatigue brought its own satisfaction. The wheat was tended, the temple stones were shaped, the pottery was formed. As stars appeared above, voices grew quieter. Children settled onto reed mats. Adults spoke in low tones about tomorrow's tasks, then fell silent. The village sounds faded. No more grinding of grain, no more hammering. From workshops, only the distant flow of the river continued through the night, marking time as Egypt slept. The sun rose each morning over the eastern desert, and with it came the stirring of life along the Nile. Farmers woke before dawn, their movements guided by the same rhythm that had shaped their fathers' days and their fathers before them. The river itself set the pace of existence, its annual flood determining when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. In the villages, women ground grain as the first light touched the mud brick walls of their homes. The sound of stone against stone created a steady rhythm that mixed with the calls of water birds and the splash of fishermen casting their nets. Children helped tend the animals, leading goats and cattle to drink at the river's edge while the air was still cool. As the sun climbed higher, work shifted with the heat. Craftsmen moved to shaded workshops. Potters shaped clay vessels, and weavers worked their looms in doorways where breezes could reach them. The afternoon brought a pause, a time when even the busiest household grew quiet. Then, as evening approached, activity resumed. Families gathered to share the day's meal as shadows lengthened across the fields, and oil lamps began to flicker in windows, marking the gentle transition into night. The rhythm of life along the Nile carried forward through countless generations. A farmer's son learned to read the river's moods just as his father had, watching the water levels rise and fall with the seasons. The same wooden tools passed from weathered hands to younger ones, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. In the villages, mothers taught daughters the exact motions for grinding grain, the same circular movements their own mothers had shown them. Beneath the same palm trees, the sound of the grinding stones created a familiar pulse that marked the early morning hours, just as it had for their grandmothers. Temple priests performed daily rituals in the same sequence their predecessors had followed, lighting incense at dawn, offering prayers at specific moments. When the sun reached certain points in the sky, the words they spoke had been spoken in these same stone halls for generations beyond memory. Even the potters at their wheels shaped vessels, using techniques unchanged since their ancestors first discovered how river clay could be transformed by fire. Children played the same games in the same dusty streets, their laughter echoing where their parents' laughter had once filled the evening air. The Nile curved through the land like a great serpent, its waters dark and slow in the evening light. Along its banks, villages clustered close to the life-giving river, their mud brick houses catching the last warmth of the day. The desert pressed in from both sides, golden and silent, but here by the water, date palms swayed and fields of barley rippled in the breeze. Each year, the river rose and fell with perfect rhythm. When the waters swelled, they brought rich black soil from far upstream, spreading it across the floodplain like a gentle blanket. Farmers watched the river levels carefully, reading its moods through markers on the banks. Too little flood meant hunger. Too much meant destruction. The heat shaped the daily rhythm of work. In the cool mornings, fishermen cast their nets, while farmers tended their fields. By midday, when the sun blazed overhead, people retreated to the shade of their homes or beneath the sycamore trees. The river breeze brought relief, carrying the scent of lotus flowers and wet earth. As darkness fell, oil lamps flickered to life in windows, and families gathered on flat rooftops where the night air was cooler, sharing quiet conversation under the stars. The river moved through the valley with a certainty that shaped everything around it. Each year, the waters rose and fell in a pattern so reliable that entire communities built their lives around its rhythm. When the floods came, they brought dark, fertile soil that spread across the fields like a blanket. This was the gift that made life possible in the desert. Farmers watched the river carefully, reading its moods like an old friend. They knew when the waters would rise by watching the stars and feeling the subtle changes in the air. During the flood season, villages became islands connected by small boats that moved between houses and fields. Children played in the shallow waters while their parents prepared the land for planting. When the waters receded, the real work began. The rich black earth left behind was perfect for growing barley and wheat. Every family knew their role in this cycle. Some repaired the irrigation channels that would bring water to the crops throughout the growing season. Others prepared the seeds, blessing them. In small ceremonies before planting, the river's rhythm became the heartbeat of the community, marking time in a way that clocks never could. And so, our journey through ancient Egypt comes to a close. The pyramids still stand, the Nile still flows, and their secrets remain, waiting for you to return. Thank you for spending this night with Nightly Lore. Sweet dreams, and may the ancient stars guide your sleep. Until next time, good night.